Yeah, no, I had a bonefish mysteriously turn into a shark one time, and it was not awesome. But thank you everybody for tuning into the talk on the last day. This work is really cool, and it covers a handful of different case studies that ultimately led to the discovery, uh, evaluation, and then ultimately the protection of a spawning aggregation. So really, really cool, and it's a lot of it's due to the conceptual model that we work in a BTT in this co-production space. And I think this is a great example how fishers and managers and scientists all came together to protect something proactively instead of reactively. So the conversation here is about bonefish. They are an awesome recreational catch and release only species, and in Florida, at least at one time, we were known to have the world's best bone fishery due to the abundance of large fish. However, in the mid-90s, there was a progressive decline punctuated by a collapse following an extreme cold event. But phenomenally, 5 years later, the fishery began to recover. And what you're seeing now are time series. Two are from a catch logs in Key West and the Lower Keys, and the other one's from a tournament record from 1968. But nonetheless, in all three of these records, you can see CPUE jumping right around the mid-2010s. Now, 10 years post this recovery phase, the demography of the fishery is not only showing juveniles, but also showing enough sexually mature fish that are getting older, suggesting that these fish are forming spawning aggregations that are becoming more consistent in space and time, and then more frequent. So in this recovery phase, really provided us this wonderful opportunity to discover these aggregations and map them and ultimately protect them before their discovery by the wider public when they become more obvious. So a little bit about the bonefish spawning ecology. They're a pretty stereotypical transient aggregating species. They leave their home flat, seagrass, meadow, whatever, form these conspicuous spawning aggregations generally everywhere near or adjacent to shorelines. Here they're vulnerable to fishing. Then ultimately spawn at depths that exceed 1,000 meters, where they dive down 100 meters to deposit their eggs. Our approach to finding these involved three phases. We relied on LEK to kind of get us in the general vicinity of where these aggregations were. The second part was passive tracking. Once we had agreement from enough fishers to tell us where spawning activity may occur, we form a passive tracking study. When we have agreement from both the passive tracking and the guides, we follow that up with active tracking and field validations to ultimately lead to the discovery of these aggregations. For our LEK work, we had two processes of these. First, we interviewed a ton of old guides that have been around forever with the kind of semi-structured interviews. In addition to that, we tapped into the younger fleet through word of mouth. They all kind of knew me at this time, and I just let them know, call me if you saw bonefish doing anything that was weird. And that was really successful. And then I stalked Instagram and Facebook for a while. Anytime I saw something was out of the ordinary, I'd call them or text them and ask them questions about where that was. Nonetheless, we had 18 candidate sites that could be a potential spawning aggregation. And I should back up a little bit. One thing that was very obvious when we did these interviews and these talking to these fishers that were seeing spawning activity is either the spawning aggregation process or the aggregation formation in the Florida Keys was fundamentally different than everywhere else in the world, or no one had really ever seen a spawning aggregation for bonefish in the Florida Keys before. Nonetheless, out of the 18 areas, candidate areas that could support spawning aggregation, that had spawning activity, this place known as Elliott Key up here in the white box had 3 times more reports than the next highest site. We did a tracking study. It was great. We were able to show spawning migrations from about 80 miles away, or however many kilometers that is, from central Florida Keys up. Loads of consistent spawning activity. It was great. Following some on-field work, we led to the ultimate discovery of this aggregation that occurred here off Elliott Key. And what I really learned from this experience, by far the most thing that was impressed upon me, was the power of media in conjunction with good science. So on April 2nd of 2023, we knew the aggregation was going to be forming. We got pretty good at predicting it. One of my good friends happened to be an outdoor video photographer or a filmographer, and he was at the bar that day when I knew it was going to be happening. So I'm like, come on, I pick you up. Can we go? He hopped in the boat, and in this video we got 30 seconds of footage, probably had more impact or just as much impact as the great science that we did. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to see, but it's thousands of bonefish. They're huge, untapped, just, whoa. It's even the computer's freaking out. It doesn't even have to do with it all. But I mean, just fish. I mean, there's so many big fish in there that you don't even see in the fishery. And this really impressed upon many of the fishers that might have been on the fence about how important this area was. And and certainly the managers that ended up ultimately making the decision to protect it. So one thing that now we can kind of figure out why no one has ever really seen these aggregations, or if they had, we found out a couple people had and they were fishing them, but they're all right. But the reason why that we were not getting signals of an aggregation was because, unlike the Bahamas or Belize or these other places that form adjacent to the coastlines, these aggregations are on the reef like everything else. So yeah, when we were out there, we did a handful of more field validations. We got sonograms of the aggregation. We were able to track it on 7 different days, but the one thing to note is the area that we were able to mark the aggregation or track it is this really discrete small area in this hole in the reef. So really tractable both for spatial management, but also pretty vulnerable for fishing given its consistency in space. Last but not least, we ultimately documented spawning. So what we did is we fitted some fish with continuous pingers and inevitably followed them for 18 hours overnight until they eventually spawn. So what you're seeing on the left is the migration track to the spawning site, and on the right is a depth profile of 2 fish that were fitted with acoustic continuous pingers. There was actually 6 tagged fish in this aggregation, which is incredible considering we were tagging them on the flats. But nonetheless, you can see this migration to the reef edge, coupled with a spawning rush here where one fish either died or presumably spawned out the tag, and another fish that spawned and left. So super exciting to complete this process, and we were all super stoked. But this is the first step. Honestly, this is like kind of the next part is really starting to get cool. So as in the classic co-production sense, we've been keeping the managers updated on what we're doing. And after we discovered this, we met with one of the 2 management agencies responsible for safeguarding this area. The 2 management agencies are federal management agencies, the National Park Service. This is in Biscayne National Park. That's largely responsible for protecting the habitats in the area. They're much more in favor of science-based spatial management, whereas our state agency, which I love to death, is much more in favor of access at all costs. So we have these kind of opposing viewpoints on how exactly we manage our resources. In a nutshell, when we presented this information to the Biscayne National Park, we showed them this figure. We didn't have this yellow polygon at the time, but we had this. This is the spatial ecology of the aggregation. It's super consistent. And they laughed. And we're like, what's so funny? This is cool. And they're like, well, we proposed this MPA here to protect corals, a bunch of years ago, and it got shut down by the state. So they were excited with the opportunity that this data could help potentially revitalize the conversation of this MPA and potentially modify it to include the bonefish aggregation. So we were able to get some resources from them in addition to the Ocean Tracking Network and partner with Rob Lennox at Delhi University to answer 2 questions. How consistent is this aggregation in space? And how consistent is this aggregation in time across months and seasons and across years? So we did this cool thing, developed a gridded array, stretched out about where we thought the aggregation would begin and end. Rob ran some GAMs fitted with a 3-dimensional spatial temporal smoother. And what you're seeing is the results from this. So over here, these are the months that we were tracking the spawning aggregation. And it's not necessarily the brightness of the contrast that's important, it's where the contrast is occurring. And where you can see the contrast is essentially in the same spot across all months. And it's actually across years as well. And if you like raw data instead of math, looks like that. In this small box, really spatially constrained to this kind of chunk in this hole in the reef. What actually turned into a major kind of, for me, an annoyance, for managers a challenge, was that they have this bimodal spawning season. And what you're seeing on these figures are 3 years of data from our tracking data, number of fish detected per day at this aggregation site. And long story short, you see these spikes, but in this gray area, you see this period of time where they take off spawning. So essentially, to protect the entire spawning season, you really need to protect 7 months, and where you can get what includes this period of time where they don't really spawn, which again turned out to be a problem, as you'll see later down the road. But nonetheless, cool consistency. At least we got some consistency across years. So the next question is, okay, so we know that aggregations are really cool. They need to be protected. They're fundamental to the sustainability of the fish. We also, in Florida, have a history and track record, have catch and release aggregation fisheries developing around these species that are culturally managed as catch and release. And attached to those, whether that you're in Bahia Honda or at Western Dry Rocks that Jessica Robichard presented on, is there's a ton of depredation and post-release predation. So though this aggregation wasn't well known, well, actually known by two guys, me and this other dude, if it was widely discovered, it's it's not unrealistic to believe one of this type of fishery would develop out there. And given the advent of social media, actually we have a good case study of that recently. A fishery can turn there really quickly and get unsustainable really quickly. So we brought this to the attention of our state fishery managers. They're like, yeah, we get it. This is a really good idea. Let's bring this to rulemaking. Let's run some workshops in the area that would be impacted by a closure, which is in the Miami-Dade County area. So we had several, I think 3 workshops during the spring of 2025. And the gist of the workshops were 3 things. One, they're like, okay, we understand why it should be closed down. We get that. Sounds good. B, why the hell are you telling us where this is, you idiots? Like, this should be kept secret, which I totally agree with. I wish we could change that. And C, the 7-month thing is too long. We just can't accept a 7-month closure, which I have feelings about. But nonetheless, the public decided it was too long. So despite the science that said it was the right thing to do, we had to come up with a solution very quickly. So the state came back to us, and we had final rulemaking happening in like 2 months. Like, you guys need to give me some justification of which season we protect, the fall spawn or the spring spawn. This is now past the spawning season, so we can't like do any on the field work real quick. So like, shit, okay, let's think of something, to justify this. And so we're like, oh, how about accessibility? Maybe if one season is just harder to fish than the other season, that'll kind of safeguard it naturally. While if there's one that's more accessible, that should probably justify further protection. So we looked at several metrics, wave height, suggesting that bigger waves would probably keep people out. The space the aggregation used, though the core area was the same, there was some wiggle among how big or small the area actually was that they were using. And also what other non-conflicting marine uses were happening in this area at the time. So for wave heights, the fall, more waves. That has a prevailing northeast wind that fights the Gulf Stream, causing this miserable condition out there. It's cold, it's murky, it's wet, it sucks. In the springtime, it's clear water, it's much more pleasant, it's warm, it's nice. So just the attractiveness of fishing in the fall versus the spring wins. And we did some metrics. We looked at kind of receiver evenness metrics and calculated the area under the curve for both seasons. Blue line is the fall, green line is the spring. Nonetheless, you can see that the blue line is taller than the green line, suggesting that the aggregation, though the core area is the same, they still kind of use a sloppy amount of the array, suggesting both that it would be harder to find if you're someone trying to look for it if it's moving around more, and second, that'd be a much bigger MPA that obviously the people aren't going to be fans of. And last, there was a lobster trap fishery that happened there in the fall. Non-conflicting use, though it's not great for the corals, nonetheless doesn't affect the bonefish. So from those kind of processes, the state did a final rulemaking and decided to protect the spring spawning peak, which inevitably does have more spawns, which is kind of cool, but leave the fall open. So this is, in a sense, it's a good win that we did get something happened here, and now we're in this 5-year review period where we're doing additional science to evaluate, is this too little? Is it too much? And does it need to be modified in 5 years to adequately protect the species? So again, it's been great work, and I think it's just been a great example of co-production. We worked with a tremendous amount of fishers that not only provided us information about spawning activity that they were seeing, helped us tag fish, helped us deploy receivers, all the things that we need help with. And a big thanks to Captain Joe Gonzalez. He was Funny Bone Charters, loved bonefish, loved the science, unfortunately passed away halfway through the study. But I think he'd be really proud of the work that we did and the work that he contributed to. So we owe him a lot. Additionally to all the scientists that were involved in the project, and ultimately, of course, the managers that really were great to work with through this process. So at this point, I'll take any questions, I guess, if I got time.